It started, as these things often do, with a letter. The envelope was thin, the paper inside crisp and folded with the precision of a banker counting $100 bills. It arrived on a Thursday, tucked between a stack of coupon flyers and a postcard for gutter cleaning, its plain white surface bearing only the embossed seal of the Sycamore Lane Homeowners Association in the top corner. There was no hint of the storm it would bring. Marie Johnson found it in her mailbox just before lunch, her slender fingers lifting it from the metal slot with the same casual grace she used to slice into a ripe peach or fold a linen napkin. She paused, her sharp, dark eyes narrowing slightly as she felt the weight of the paper, the way it seemed to demand more attention than the junk mail it had nestled beside. She stepped back inside, the screen door creaking softly as it closed behind her, the faint smell of baked cornbread and lavender lingering in the air. Her grandson, James, was sprawled on the living room floor, his long legs crossed, his head bent over a sketchpad as he shaded the outline of a classic 1967 Mustang. He glanced up as she entered, his eyes flicking to the letter in her hand. "What's that, Grandma?" Marie set the rest of the mail on the small wooden side table near the entryway, the polished surface reflecting the sunlight streaming through the lace curtains. She took a seat in her favorite armchair, the one with the floral upholstery that had seen 3 generations of Johnsons come and go, and slipped her finger beneath the envelope flap. It tore with a clean, satisfying sound. "It's from the HOA," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with the faintest hint of curiosity. She unfolded the single sheet of paper, her eyes moving quickly over the neatly typed lines. As she read, her lips pressed into a thin, unamused line. She paused, then read it again, slower this time, letting each word settle like dust on a polished floor. "Dear Mrs. Johnson, we are writing to inform you that your front porch is currently in violation of Sycamore Lane's aesthetic guidelines. Specifically, the recent addition of your rocking chairs, potted plants, and hanging wind chimes do not conform to the approved standards for external decor. We kindly request that you remove these items within the next 7 days to avoid further action. We appreciate your understanding and cooperation in maintaining the overall appearance and value of our community. Sincerely, the Sycamore Lane HOA Board." Marie exhaled slowly, the paper crinkling slightly in her grasp as she folded it neatly back along its original creases. She set it on the side table beside the other mail, her fingers brushing the edge of the smooth, polished wood, and leaned back into her chair. She closed her eyes for a moment, her mind slipping back through the decades, past the carefully manicured lawns of her current neighborhood, past the busy streets of her youth, past the smoke-filled rooms and whispered conversations of a time when her words had carried the weight of consequence. James watched her carefully, sensing the slight tension in the air, the way her usually calm expression had tightened just a fraction. He set his pencil down, the soft clatter breaking the silence. "Something wrong, Grandma?" Marie opened her eyes, met his concerned gaze, and offered a small, reassuring smile. "Oh, nothing I can't handle, baby," she said, her voice slipping back into its usual, easy cadence. "Just the HOA being the HOA. Seems they don't like my porch decorations." James frowned, his brows drawing together in a way that reminded Marie so much of his late father, her only son, that it almost brought a tear to her eye. He was protective like that, always had been, even as a little boy. "They can't just tell you what to do with your own porch," he said, his tone indignant. "You've lived here longer than most of them have even had their mortgages." Marie chuckled softly, the sound low and rich, like the deep notes of a church organ. "That's true," she said, her eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. "But you know how some folks get when they think a place is theirs to control." James shook his head, muttering something under his breath about busybody neighbors and too much free time, before returning to his sketch, his pencil scratching furiously against the textured paper. Marie watched him for a moment, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and nostalgia, before she stood, smoothing the front of her cotton dress with a slow, deliberate motion. She walked to the front door, her steps unhurried, her bare feet whispering across the cool hardwood floors, and stepped out onto the porch. She paused at the top of the steps, her eyes sweeping over the scene before her. The 2 wooden rocking chairs she had painted herself, their glossy black surfaces gleaming in the midday sun. The array of potted plants she had tended with the same care she had once given her young son, each leaf a testament to her patient hands. The wind chimes that hung from the porch eaves, their soft, melodic clinking stirred by the gentle summer breeze. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the warm, floral-scented air, and felt a quiet, unshakable certainty settle into her bones. They thought they could push her back into the shadows, reduce her presence to a silent, invisible thing. They thought they could make her small, make her compliant, make her forget who she was. They were wrong. Marie stepped back inside, closed the door behind her with a firm, resolute click, and walked to the kitchen. She reached for the old rotary phone mounted on the wall, its black receiver cool and familiar in her hand, and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. The line rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. "Yeah." Marie smiled, her eyes sparkling with a quiet, knowing confidence. "It's Marie. I'm going to need a little help with something. You still got that old connection at City Hall?" There was a pause, then a low, appreciative chuckle on the other end. "For you, Marie? Always. What's the problem?" Marie glanced back at the letter still sitting on the side table, the crisp white paper catching the light like a warning flare. "Just a little porch trouble. Nothing I can't handle. But I think it's time I reminded some folks who they're dealing with." She hung up the phone, her heart beating steady and strong, and allowed herself one small, satisfied smile. This was going to be interesting. Marie didn't waste time. She had learned long ago that silence only served those who hoped their power would go unchecked. By Friday morning, she had a plan. Not a loud, confrontational one. No, that wasn't her style. She preferred the kind of approach that left people wondering how they had lost control without ever seeing it slip from their grasp. She made a few phone calls, sent a few emails, and by the afternoon, a quiet ripple had begun moving through Sycamore Lane, a ripple that would soon become a wave. The first call had been to her old friend, Lenny Parker. He was a former city planner turned zoning consultant, a man who had spent decades drafting the very ordinances and building codes that homeowners associations loved to quote. He had been a sharp dresser in his younger years, known for his perfectly knotted ties and polished shoes. But now he was retired, a bit rounder in the waist, with a voice that crackled like an old radio, and a mind still sharp enough to cut through red tape, like a hot knife through butter. "Marie," he had said when he picked up her call, his tone warm but curious. "It's been a while. What can I do for you?" Marie had smiled, leaning back into her floral armchair, the letter from the HOA still sitting on the side table beside her, a silent reminder of the fight she had just chosen. "Lenny, I need to know everything there is to know about HOA overreach, porch regulations, and property rights. Think you can help me out?" Lenny had laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that made Marie's chest swell with nostalgia. "You asking me if I can handle a few nosy busybodies with clipboards? Honey, I wrote the playbook they're trying to use against you. I'll have some notes for you by tomorrow." Her second call had been to her niece, Sarah Johnson, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney with a reputation for cutting through corporate nonsense like a blade through wet paper. Sarah had taken the call on her lunch break, the clatter of a bustling downtown cafe in the background. "Aunt Marie," she had said, her tone a mixture of surprise and delight. "What's got you all fired up today?" Marie had smiled, her fingers tracing the floral pattern on the armrest beside her. "Oh, just a little porch drama. The HOA thinks they can tell me what I can and can't have on my own front steps. Thought I might get a second opinion before I start making noise." Sarah had let out a sharp, approving laugh. "You came to the right place. Send me a copy of whatever they sent you. I'll tear it apart over my next espresso." By the time the sun set that evening, Marie had a small but formidable team in place. A city planner, a lawyer, and a lifetime's worth of quiet, unassuming power. She hadn't gone looking for a fight, but now that it had found her, she intended to end it on her terms. The following Monday, Marie received a neatly printed agenda for the upcoming HOA meeting, slipped through her mail slot like a summons. She set it on the kitchen table beside her coffee cup, noting the clean, impersonal lines of the typed list. Call to order. Financial review. Landscaping committee update. Community events planning. Enforcement of porch aesthetic guidelines. New business. Adjournment. Marie tapped her finger against the fifth item, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. She didn't need to be a lawyer to see where this was going. They planned to make an example of her, to use her porch as a cautionary tale for the rest of the neighborhood. They expected her to sit quietly, perhaps offer a weak protest, then fold under the pressure of their bureaucratic gaze. They had no idea what they had awakened. On the night of the meeting, Marie arrived early, her floral dress freshly pressed, her hair pulled back into a neat chignon, her shoes polished to a soft, understated shine. She entered the small, fluorescent-lit meeting room with her head held high, her sharp eyes scanning the faces of her neighbors as they murmured among themselves, their voices tinged with the low hum of anticipation and curiosity. The board members sat in a neat row at the front of the room, their chairs slightly elevated on a small platform that made them look like judges presiding over a courtroom. Marie took a seat near the front, setting her leather purse on the floor beside her feet, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't look at the agenda in her hand. She didn't need to. She had already memorized it. The meeting started promptly at 7 p.m. The board president, a tall, lean man named Richard Carlyle, tapping his gavel against the wooden tabletop like a professor calling his class to order. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began reading the agenda in a clipped, authoritative tone, his voice carrying easily over the low murmur of the gathered residents. Marie listened patiently as the financial review droned on. The landscaping committee chair complained about unauthorized garden gnomes, and the community events planner presented a slideshow of last summer's poorly attended barbecue. She let her gaze wander, taking in the faces of her neighbors, some bored, some attentive, a few already checking their watches. She felt a small, quiet thrill at the thought of what was coming, at the slow, inevitable shift she had set in motion. Finally, Richard reached the fifth item on the agenda. He straightened his tie, glanced down at his notes, and leaned into the microphone. Next, we have a matter concerning the enforcement of our porch aesthetic guidelines. Specifically, a recent violation involving excessive outdoor decor that does not conform to the community's established standards. He paused, his eyes flicking to Marie, a thin, self-satisfied smile spreading across his lips. Mrs. Johnson, I believe you know this matter concerns you. Marie smiled, her gaze steady, her fingers still folded neatly in her lap. Yes, Mr. Carlyle, she said, her voice clear but calm, cutting through the tension like a razor through silk. I'm well aware, and I'd be happy to discuss it. But first, I have a few documents I'd like to share with the board. She reached down, lifted her purse onto her lap, and pulled out a neatly bound folder, its contents carefully curated over the past week. Lenny's notes on HOA overreach, Sarah's legal analysis, and a few carefully selected pages from the city's zoning codes. She held it up for the room to see, her eyes never leaving Richard's. Richard's confident smile faltered, his fingers tightening around the edges of his notes. He hadn't expected this. He had assumed she would fold, that she would apologize, that she would retreat. He had no idea what he was about to step into. Marie leaned back in her chair, the leather cool against her back, and allowed herself one small, satisfied breath. The game had just begun. Marie felt the weight of the room shift the moment she held up the folder. The air grew heavier, the soft rustle of paper and the creak of folding chairs settling into a tense, anticipatory silence. She saw it in the slight widening of Richard's eyes, the nervous glance he shot toward the other board members, the subtle way his fingers tightened around his neatly typed notes. He had expected a small, compliant widow, a woman easily intimidated by the polished formality of the board's procedures. He hadn't expected a strategist. He hadn't expected a woman who had spent decades moving through rooms where decisions shaped lives, where words carried the weight of promises and policies, where the right document at the right moment could change the course of a conversation before it even began. Marie didn't rush. She set the folder down on the small, folding table in front of her, opened it with a careful, deliberate motion, and pulled out the first set of papers. She glanced around the room, her sharp eyes catching the curious, cautious gazes of her neighbors, the way some leaned forward slightly, their interest piqued, their whispers falling into an expectant hush. Before we discuss my porch, Marie began, her voice steady but firm, carrying easily across the room without the need for a microphone. I'd like to address a few misconceptions about property rights and homeowner autonomy. You see, I've spent the past week reviewing not just the HOA guidelines, but but also the municipal codes and zoning laws that this association claims to be enforcing. She let the words hang in the air for a moment, felt the subtle shift in energy as Richard's confident posture deflated just a fraction, his mouth tightening into a thin, nervous line. Marie picked up the first paper, a neatly printed page with Lenny's notes scrawled in precise, blue ink along the margins. First, let's talk about the term aesthetic guidelines. The language in your letter reference section 3.2.5 of the Sycamore Lane HOA Covenant, which states that all exterior modifications must conform to the established aesthetic standards of the community. However, what you failed to mention is that these standards are legally classified as suggestions under our local zoning ordinances, not enforceable mandates. In other words, unless a specific alteration poses a direct safety risk or violates city code, it cannot be unilaterally prohibited by this board. She glanced up, met Richard's startled gaze, and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. I spoke with a former city planner about this. He confirmed that the language in your covenant is intentionally vague, likely to avoid legal challenges, but it lacks the teeth you're pretending it has. A few quiet murmurs rippled through the room. Marie saw a few heads nodding, a few eyebrows lifting in sudden, cautious interest. She let the noise settle, then moved to the next page, flipping it over with the same steady, unhurried precision. Second, she continued, her voice never wavering, I'd like to address the concept of visual harmony, which your letter claims my porch violates. Now, I've reviewed the bylaws, and nowhere do they define this term in measurable, objective language. In fact, the only reference to harmony in the entire document is a single line about maintaining the overall aesthetic balance of the neighborhood, which is, legally speaking, a subjective standard. And as we all know, subjective standards are notoriously difficult to enforce without clear, specific guidelines, which, by the way, this board has never bothered to publish. She saw Richard's jaw clench, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. The other board members exchanged nervous glances, their eyes flicking between Marie and the neatly stacked papers in front of her, as if hoping the documents would somehow disprove her point without requiring them to actually speak. Marie set down the second page, her movements slow and deliberate, like a conductor leading an orchestra through the first notes of a symphony. She reached for the third paper, her fingers brushing the cool, smooth surface of the table as she lifted it into the light. And finally, she said, her voice dropping into a slightly lower, more deliberate tone, we come to the issue of enforcement. You see, in order to legally fine a resident or demand the removal of personal property, you must demonstrate that the violation in question is not only documented, but also consistently enforced. Yet, as far as I can tell, there are at least a dozen other homes in this neighborhood with porch furniture, potted plants, and wind chimes identical to mine, none of which have received so much as a warning letter. The room fell into a deeper silence, the kind that feels like the moment just before a summer storm breaks, the air thick and expectant, every breath tinged with the faint, metallic taste of anticipation. Marie leaned back in her chair, folded her hands neatly in her lap, and allowed herself one slow, steady breath. So, she said, her eyes never leaving Richard's increasingly pale face, either this board is selectively enforcing its guidelines, which is a direct violation of both state housing law and federal anti-discrimination statutes, or you're attempting to intimidate me into removing my legally protected property based on nothing more than subjective opinion and personal preference. Which is it, Mr. Carlyle? Richard's mouth opened, closed, then opened again, his eyes darting to the other board members, their faces a mixture of shock, confusion, and growing concern. He stammered for a moment, his carefully rehearsed authority crumbling under the weight of Marie's calm, relentless logic. Well, I think we should take a moment to review these documents before making any final decisions, he said, his voice thin and strained, the polished veneer of his authority cracking like cheap paint on a neglected wall. Marie smiled, a small, patient curve of her lips, and reached for her purse. She pulled out a small, black notebook, flipped it open, and set it on the table beside her folder. Take all the time you need, she said, her tone polite but unyielding. I'll be right here. She watched as Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes unfocused, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached for his water glass. She had seen this look before, decades ago, in the faces of men who had thought they could speak over her, dismiss her, silence her. Men who had learned, too late, that Marie Johnson was not a woman to be intimidated. As the board fumbled for their next move, Marie leaned back, folded her hands neatly in her lap, and allowed herself one small, satisfied breath. The game, it seemed, was already over. The board spent the next few days in a quiet panic. Marie could feel it in the way the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcers suddenly avoided eye contact as she passed them on her morning walks, their once proud, clipboard-wielding strides reduced to hurried shuffles. She could see it in the way Richard's pristine, white Mercedes slowed as it passed her house each morning, his gaze flicking nervously to her neatly arranged porch, the very one he had tried to erase from the landscape of his perfect little world. He never stopped, never rolled down his window, just kept moving, his polished wheels crunching over the gravel like the brittle bones of a crumbling empire. Marie let them stew. She let them simmer in their own uncertainty, the same uncertainty they had tried to impose on her, the same quiet intimidation they had wielded like a cudgel against a woman they had assumed would fold under the weight of their collective judgment. But Marie didn't fold. She never had. She simply waited, her patience as unyielding as the deep, unshakable roots of the magnolia tree that shaded her front porch. It was late Thursday afternoon when the call finally came. Marie was in her garden, her hands buried deep in the cool, damp soil as she gently pressed a row of tomato seedlings into the ground, their delicate green stems trembling slightly in the warm spring breeze. She wiped her hands on her apron, stood slowly, and reached for the cordless phone she had left on the edge of the porch railing, its plastic casing warm from the sun. "Hello," she answered, her voice calm but firm, the slight edge of anticipation sharpening her tone. "Mrs. Johnson?" The voice on the other end was thin, strained, the clipped, precise tone of a man trying very hard to keep his composure. It was Richard. She could almost picture him, his jaw clenched, his neatly pressed collar tightening around his throat as he forced the words out. "This is she," Marie replied, leaning back against the porch railing, the warm, rough wood pressing into her lower back as she crossed her arms and waited for him to gather his thoughts. There was a brief, awkward silence, the faint hum of static crackling through the line as Richard searched for the right words, his mind no doubt racing through a dozen carefully rehearsed speeches, each one sounding less confident than the last. I wanted to follow up on our discussion at the meeting," he began, his voice wavering slightly, the carefully cultivated polish of his public persona slipping like a cheap toupee in a sudden gust of wind. "The board has reviewed the documents you provided, and after careful consideration, we've decided to withdraw the enforcement action against your porch." Marie smiled, a slow, satisfied curve of her lips that Richard couldn't see, but surely felt through the phone line. "I see," she replied, her tone even, her words measured. "And what, exactly, prompted this sudden change of heart?" Richard cleared his throat, the sound harsh and brittle in Marie's ear, like dry leaves crushed underfoot. "Well, after reviewing the bylaws and consulting with our legal counsel, we've determined that, perhaps we were a bit overzealous in our interpretation of the guidelines. It seems we may have, overstepped our authority." Marie let the silence stretch for a moment, let the weight of his uncomfortable admission settle into the space between them like a stone dropped into a still pond. "I appreciate your honesty," she said finally, her voice cool but not unkind. "I'm sure this was a difficult decision for you and the board. I trust this means I can expect no further letters regarding my porch decor." Of course," Richard stammered, his tone suddenly eager, almost desperate, as if hoping to close the chapter before it reopened with a vengeance. "We consider the matter fully resolved. You have our sincerest apologies for any inconvenience this may have caused." Marie allowed herself a small, satisfied breath, her fingers tightening slightly around the smooth, plastic curve of the phone. "Thank you, Richard," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I appreciate that. And I hope this serves as a reminder to the board that respect goes both ways." She hung up before he could stammer out another half-hearted apology, the click of the disconnect echoing in the quiet, sun-drenched air around her. She set the phone back on the porch railing, her hands still tingling with the residual energy of the conversation, and turned back to her garden. She knelt beside the neat row of seedlings she had just planted, her fingers once again finding their way into the cool, comforting embrace of the soil, and allowed herself a rare, private smile. She had won. Not just the battle over her porch, but something deeper, something more lasting. She had reclaimed her space, her voice, her place in a community that had tried to reduce her to a silent, invisible presence. As she stood to brush the dirt from her knees, she caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of her yard. She looked up to see her neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a cane that tapped against the pavement like the ticking of an impatient clock. She paused at the edge of Marie's lawn, her gaze sweeping over the freshly planted seedlings, the neatly arranged rocking chairs, the gently swaying wind chimes, and offered a small, approving nod. "Well done, Marie," she called, her voice strong despite her years, the faint hint of a southern drawl lingering in her words like the scent of magnolia blossoms on a warm summer night. "Well done, indeed." Marie smiled, the warm, familiar ache of long-buried pride swelling in her chest as she waved back, her heart beating steady and strong beneath the thin fabric of her apron. She had done it. She had reclaimed her space, her voice, her place in the world, and she had done it on her own terms, without raising her voice or compromising her dignity. And as she stood there, the warm sun on her back, the cool earth beneath her feet, and the gentle, melodic clinking of her wind chimes whispering in the breeze, she felt a deep, unshakable certainty settle into her bones. She hadn't just defended her porch. She had reminded them all who she really. Marie hadn't just won a small battle over porch decor. She had reclaimed her voice, her space, her right to be seen and heard without apology. But as the days passed, as the spring sun grew warmer and the neighborhood settled back into its usual rhythms, she realized that her small victory had rippled farther than she had anticipated. It was as if the act of standing her ground had shifted something fundamental in the atmosphere of Sycamore Lane, something that reached beyond her own front steps and into the hearts and minds of her neighbors. It started with small things. The Hendersons, whose porch had always been a plain, unadorned stretch of white wood, suddenly hung a pair of hanging baskets overflowing with bright red geraniums, their bold color a quiet but unmistakable statement of defiance. The Garcias down the block, a young couple who had recently moved in, added a set of wind chimes to their front porch, the metal tubes clinking softly in the breeze like a gentle, ongoing applause for Marie's quiet rebellion. Even the Macmillans, who had once complained about the faint scent of barbecue smoke drifting from Marie's backyard on Sunday afternoons, began hosting their own family cookouts, the smell of charcoal and sizzling ribs wafting down the block like a communal declaration of independence. Marie noticed these changes, smiled at them, but didn't comment. She had never sought to lead a movement, never intended to become the quiet, beating heart of a small suburban revolution. She had simply refused to be erased. And in doing so, she had given others permission to reclaim their own small corners of the world. But the real change, the one that truly shifted the balance of power on Sycamore Lane, came a few weeks later when Marie's granddaughter, Jasmine, returned from college for the summer. Jasmine was a tall, striking young woman with her grandmother's sharp eyes and unshakable confidence, her skin the deep, rich brown of freshly turned soil, her hair a crown of tight, coiled curls that she wore proudly, like a queen refusing to hide her heritage. She arrived on a warm, sunny Saturday afternoon, her beat-up, hand-me-down sedan pulling into Marie's driveway with a squeal of worn brake pads and a burst of tinny rap music blaring from the car's aging speakers. She stepped out, her long, denim-clad legs unfolding gracefully as she reached into the back seat for her suitcase, her eyes sweeping over the familiar landscape of her grandmother's front yard. "Grandma," she called, her voice clear and strong, echoing off the white siding of the house as she swung her suitcase up onto the porch with a practiced, one-handed motion. "I'm home." Marie appeared at the front door a moment later, her apron still dusted with flour from the peach cobbler she had been preparing, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and affection as she reached out to embrace her granddaughter. "Welcome home, baby," she said, her voice warm and steady as she wrapped her arms around Jasmine's shoulders, pulling her into a tight, familiar hug that smelled of fresh-baked pastry and lavender-scented lotion. "It's good to have you back." Jasmine returned the hug, her long arms wrapping easily around her grandmother's smaller frame, her cheek pressed against the soft, comforting warmth of Marie's shoulder. She pulled back a moment later, her eyes scanning the porch, the freshly painted rocking chairs, the neatly arranged flower pots, the gently swaying wind chimes, and broke into a wide, approving grin. "Damn, Grandma," she said, her tone both impressed and amused as she dropped her suitcase onto the porch and leaned against the railing. "You've really got this place looking sharp. Did you remodel or something?" Marie chuckled, a low, rich sound that carried easily on the warm, late afternoon breeze. "Something like that," she replied, her eyes twinkling with a mixture of pride and mischief. "Just making a few adjustments. Reminding the neighborhood who I am." Jasmine raised an eyebrow, her curiosity clearly piqued as she glanced around the yard, taking in the small but unmistakable signs of her grandmother's recent triumph. "What happened? Somebody give you a hard time?" Marie's smile widened, the faintest hint of a challenge sparking in her eyes as she reached for the screen door, holding it open for her granddaughter. "Oh, you know how it is," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Some folks around here forgot who they were dealing with. I just had to remind them." Jasmine's grin widened, her dark eyes sparkling with anticipation as she stepped inside, the cool, familiar air of her grandmother's house wrapping around her like a beloved, well-worn quilt. She set her suitcase down beside the hall closet, stretched her long arms over her head, and turned to face her grandmother with a knowing, approving nod. "Damn right," she said, her tone both proud and protective as she reached for the small stack of mail sitting on the hallway side table, her sharp eyes catching sight of the neatly folded HOA letter still sitting atop the pile. She picked it up, glanced over the stiff, white paper with its neatly printed lines of impersonal bureaucracy, and let out a low, appreciative whistle. "Looks like you gave them hell, Grandma," she said, her eyes meeting Marie's with a spark of shared defiance. "I love it." Marie's smile softened, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and relief as she reached for her granddaughter's hand, giving it a small, affectionate squeeze. "Just doing what I had to do," she replied, her voice quiet but steady, her eyes never leaving Jasmine's. "Just doing what I had to do." The two women stood there for a long moment, their hands clasped, their eyes locked in a silent, unspoken bond that stretched across generations, across decades of struggle and triumph, across the quiet, unyielding strength of a family that had never known the luxury of complacency. And as the warm, golden light of the setting sun spilled through the lace curtains of the front window, casting long, slanting shadows across the polished hardwood floor, Marie felt a deep, unshakable certainty settle into her bones. She hadn't just reclaimed her porch. She had reclaimed her name, her legacy, her place in the world. And she had done it without apology, without compromise, without fear. She had reminded them all who she really was. And she had made sure they would never forget it.